Greetings to all lovers of unusual historical events. Have you ever heard of a war that started because of a pig? Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? However, there really was a case in history when one grunting animal almost led to an armed conflict between two powerful nations. Imagine this. The middle of the 19th century, disputed territory between the United States and the British Empire. And at the center of it all, an ordinary domestic pig that accidentally crossed someone else's garden. This incredible story shows how sometimes the fate of entire peoples and even continents can depend on the most insignificant incidents. If you like little-known and amazing facts from the past that don't make it into traditional history textbooks, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we tell about historical curiosities, unexpected twists of fate, and events that could have completely changed the world as we know it. And today, we'll dive into the story of the so-called Pig War, an international incident that began with the most ordinary event but almost escalated into a full-scale military conflict between the United States and Great Britain. So let's travel back to 1859. The setting is San Juan Island, located between the present-day state of Washington and the Canadian island of Vancouver. At that time, the ownership of this island was the subject of a territorial dispute between the United States and the British Empire. The Oregon Treaty, signed in 1846, established the border between British and American possessions along the 49th parallel. However, the treaty's wording regarding the maritime boundary in the San Juan archipelago area was ambiguous. The Americans believed the boundary should run through the Harrow Strait, which would make the archipelago islands American territory. The British insisted on the Rosario Strait, which would leave the islands to Great Britain. As a result of this diplomatic uncertainty, both American farmers and employees of the British Hudson's Bay Company, which had established a sheep farm there, settled on San Juan Island. Both sides considered the island their territory, but for the time being coexisted relatively peacefully. Everything changed on June 15, 1859, when American farmer Lyman Cutlar discovered a black pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company in his garden. The animal was eating his potatoes, and the enraged farmer, who had already faced this problem before, grabbed his rifle and shot the pig. It would seem like an ordinary domestic conflict, thousands of which happened on farm boundaries all over the world. However, this incident took on a completely different scale due to the tense political situation. The pig's owner, Irish livestock farmer Charles Griffin, who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, demanded compensation of $100, a sum many times exceeding the actual value of the animal. Cutlar offered to pay $10, which was a fair price for a pig at that time, but refused to pay more. Then representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company threatened to arrest the American and take him to Victoria, the capital of the British colony, on Vancouver Island, for trial. This threat caused a violent reaction among American settlers on the island. They appealed for protection to American authorities, fearing that the British would begin arresting American citizens and expelling them from territory that the United States considered its own. In response to this appeal, Brigadier General William Harney, commanding the Oregon Department of the American Army, sent a company of 66 infantry soldiers to the island under the command of Captain George Pickett, who would later become famous during the American Civil War. On July 9, 1859, American soldiers landed on San Juan Island and set up camp on a hill overlooking the harbor. Captain Pickett declared the island United States territory and warned that he would defend American citizens from any encroachments by the British. Learning of the American troop landing, British Columbia Governor James Douglas immediately sent 3 warships to the island. The British were outraged by what they considered American occupation of their territory. Over the following days, tension escalated. By July 30th, 5 British warships with 70 guns and 2,000 soldiers on board were stationed off the coast of San Juan. The Americans had by then strengthened their contingent to 450 men and begun building fortifications. Captain Pickett, despite the overwhelming superiority of British forces, declared that he would not leave the island. When British Captain Geoffrey Hornby suggested joint occupation of the island, Pickett replied, "Captain Hornby, we must not let these matters lead us to conflict, but if you land your troops on this island, I will be forced to open fire." The situation was on the brink of armed confrontation. Interestingly, at this critical time among the British officers was Admiral Robert Baines, who had arrived on his flagship Ganges. Baines had orders from the Admiralty to avoid conflict with the Americans if possible. Therefore, despite having the opportunity to easily crush the American detachment, he refrained from attack. Instead, the British continued to demonstrate military might, hoping the Americans would yield without a fight. In August 1859, news of the conflict finally reached Washington and London. The reaction of both countries' governments was completely different from what the military on the ground expected. Both United States President James Buchanan and the British government were alarmed that a local dispute over a pig had nearly led to war between two major powers. President Buchanan immediately sent General Winfield Scott to the Pacific coast with authority to resolve the conflict peacefully. Scott was a veteran diplomat who had previously successfully resolved several border disputes between the United States and Britain. General Scott arrived in October and immediately began negotiations with Governor Douglas. He proposed withdrawing most American troops from the island if the British agreed not to occupy it with their forces until the final decision on territorial ownership. After several rounds of negotiations, both sides agreed to joint occupation of the island. The Americans placed a garrison at the northern end and the British at the southern end until diplomats resolved the territorial dispute. Amazingly, this temporary arrangement lasted 12 years. American and British soldiers lived on the island side by side, often in friendly relations, holding joint holidays and sporting events. In fact, this was one of the first peacekeeping troop deployments in history, although formally such a concept did not yet exist. The final resolution of the territorial dispute occurred only in 1872, when German Emperor Wilhelm I, acting as an international arbitrator, awarded San Juan Island to the United States. On November 25th of that year, British troops left the island, ending the Pig War, a conflict in which, fortunately, the only casualty remained that very pig. This story brings a smile, but it could actually have had quite serious consequences. Imagine if the British admiral's nerves had given way and he had ordered fire to be opened on American positions. Or if impulsive Captain Pickett had decided to attack British ships. The world could have witnessed a third Anglo-American war, which, given the military and economic potential of both powers in the mid-19th century, would have been much more destructive than previous conflicts. And all this because of one pig that wandered into someone else's garden. However, the story of the Pig War is interesting not only for its anecdotal nature. It demonstrates several important aspects of international relations of that time. First, it shows how inaccuracies in international treaties can lead to serious conflicts. The Oregon Treaty's wording about the maritime boundary was so vague that it allowed both sides to consider themselves right. Second, this story illustrates the role of personalities in historical events. If not for Admiral Baines's restraint and General Scott's diplomatic talent, the conflict could have taken a completely different turn. It's also interesting to consider the broader historical context of the Pig War. It occurred just 2 years before the start of the American Civil War. One can only imagine how this internal American tragedy would have developed if the country had simultaneously been at war with Great Britain. Perhaps the Civil War itself would not have begun, as an external conflict could have temporarily united North and South against a common enemy. Or, more likely, Britain could have actively supported the Confederacy, making Union victory much less likely. For the British Empire, conflict with the United States was also extremely undesirable. At that time, Britain was involved in numerous colonial enterprises around the world, including the recently concluded Indian Rebellion. War with the United States would have diverted valuable resources from maintaining control over the vast empire and could have undermined British influence in other regions. The fate of the main characters in this story also deserves attention. Captain George Pickett, who so decisively defended American interests on San Juan Island, became a Confederate general just a few years later and led the famous Pickett's Charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most tragic and bloody battles of the Civil War. Governor James Douglas, representing the British side, was one of the founders of British Columbia and later became known as the Father of British Columbia. As for San Juan Island itself, today it is part of Washington State and is known for its scenic landscapes, ocean views, and of course, historical sites related to the Pig War. The American Camp, British Camp, National Historical Park preserves the memory of those events and attracts tourists interested in this unusual episode of American-British relations. And what happened to the main culprit of the conflict? That very pig? Unfortunately, little is known about her. We only know that it was a large black pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company, and that she had a habit of wandering onto American farmer Lyman Cutlar's plot. After the animal was shot, its carcass was probably used for its intended purpose, for food. But although the pig itself ended its life quite prosaically, the memory of her lives on in history as the animal that nearly caused a war between two great powers? This story raises an interesting question. How often in history have seemingly insignificant events become the cause of serious international conflicts? In fact, there are quite a few such examples. Let's recall at least the War of Jenkins' Ear between Great Britain and Spain in the 18th century, which began after the Spanish Coast Guard cut off the ear of British Captain Robert Jenkins. Or the Football War of 1969 between El Salvador and Honduras, when tension between the countries reached its peak after a football match. These examples show that sometimes even the most insignificant incidents can become a trigger for conflict if there are deeper contradictions and tensions. Returning to the Pig War, it's worth noting that it left a mark not only in history, but also in culture. The events of those days became the subject of books, films, and even musical works. Historical reenactments are held annually on San Juan Island, allowing tourists and locals to immerse themselves in the atmosphere of those days and better understand how an ordinary pig nearly changed the course of history. Particularly interesting is the fact that the joint occupation of the island by American and British troops for 12 years proceeded almost idyllically. Soldiers of the warring sides not only did not conflict, but actively communicated, held joint holidays, sports competitions, and even organized theatrical performances. This is a vivid example of how ordinary people, soldiers of opposing armies, can coexist peacefully when politicians give them such an opportunity. Perhaps this is one of the most important lessons of the Pig War. Today, when international conflicts often arise due to disagreement of positions and inability to find compromise, the story of the Pig War reminds us of the importance of diplomacy, patience, and readiness to seek peaceful solutions. The fact that a potentially destructive conflict was resolved without a single shot being fired, not counting the shot at the pig, is evidence that even in the most tense situations, there is always an alternative to military solution. Also noteworthy is the role of international arbitration in resolving the conflict. Turning to the German emperor as a neutral third party for the final decision on the territorial dispute was an advanced practice for that time. Today, such an approach is the foundation of international law and the activities of organizations like the United Nations International Court of Justice. The Pig War became one of the early examples of successful application of this principle. In conclusion, we can say that the story of the Pig War is not just a funny historical anecdote. It's a lesson about how easily insignificant incidents can escalate into serious international crises, and at the same time, an example of how common sense, diplomacy, and readiness for compromise can prevent tragic consequences. This is a story about human errors and wisdom, about tension and reconciliation, about how one pig nearly changed the course of world history, but ultimately led to strengthening peaceful relations between two great powers. I hope this story was as fascinating for you as it was for me when studying it. If you enjoyed our journey into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss new episodes about unusual and little-known historical events. And in the comments, tell us whether you've heard about the Pig War before and what other unusual historical conflicts you know about. Maybe you know other examples when an insignificant incident nearly led to serious international consequences. In future episodes, we'll continue exploring amazing turns of history that for one reason or another didn't make it into school textbook pages, but didn't become less interesting or significant because of it. History is full of surprises, and sometimes the most insignificant events can have the most unexpected consequences. Until we meet again,